Sometime around 4,200 years ago, across a vast stretch of grassland east of the Caspian Sea, a population of horse-riding, wagon-pulling pastoralists began moving west, and within a few centuries they had replaced or absorbed nearly every human lineage that had called Europe home for thousands of years. Cities rose and fell. Languages vanished. Bloodlines that had persisted for 30 millennia were diluted into near invisibility. The continent was genetically remade almost from scratch. Almost. Wedged between the Western Pyrenees and the Bay of Biscay, in a stretch of mountain and coastline that straddles the modern border of France and Spain, one population slipped through. They speak a language with no relatives anywhere on Earth. Their surnames don't rhyme with French names or Spanish names or it's they rhyme with nothing, and their DNA, when modern scientists finally looked closely, was unlike anything else in Europe. Not slightly different, genuinely, measurably, statistically anomalous, a biological signature that should, by every population model we have been buried under thousands of years of migration and mixture. It wasn't. It isn't. This is the story of the Basque people, and of what their genome reveals about a world that we thought had vanished completely. Before the genetics laboratories weighed in, the story of European origin seemed, at least to archaeologists and linguists, reasonably well understood. The evidence was physical, tangible, spread across thousands of excavation sites, flint tools from the Mesolithic, pottery traditions that could be traced as they moved across the continent, megalithic tombs, long barrows, passage graves, stone circles, scattered from Ireland to Scandinavia, suggesting shared ritual practices among Neolithic farming cultures that had swept in from Anatolia beginning around 9,000 years ago. The picture was one of gradual replacement and assimilation. Hunter-gatherers were absorbed into farming communities, farmers built monuments, languages evolved, and the Basque, under this model, was simply an isolated pocket. Linguistically unusual, perhaps, but not dramatically different beneath the skin. Their language, Euskara, had long been the curiosity that drew scholars in. It is a language isolate in the strictest possible sense, not descended from Proto-Indo-European, not related to Semitic languages, not connected to any language family discovered anywhere on the planet. Linguists spent decades hunting for relatives. The Caucasian language families were proposed. Ancient Iberian inscriptions were compared, letter by letter. Nothing matched. The consensus that emerged was tidy, if somewhat unsatisfying. The Basque were descended from pre-Indo-European inhabitants of Iberia, their language a survivor from an earlier layer of European settlement, their genetic distinctiveness a product of mountain isolation and cultural insularity. Pyrenean geography as a kind of accidental time capsule. The physical remains from the region told a consistent story. Burial practices at sites like La Bragne in Leon and Lochebourg in Luxembourg, skeletal remains from Western European hunter-gatherers dating back 8,000 and 9,000 years, showed a population that had inhabited Atlantic Europe since the retreat of the glaciers. When Neolithic farmers arrived from the east, the archaeological record showed gradual mixing, gradual adoption of farming tools and domesticated animals and ceramic traditions. The consensus held that modern Basques were probably a mixture of these early layers, somewhat more isolated than their neighbors, somewhat more genetically conservative, but not fundamentally different from other Western Europeans. The textbook explanation was logical. It was supported by language maps and artifact distributions and burial site comparisons. Scholars agreed on the broad outline. It was a tidy story, the biology refused. Then DNA arrived, not in the sense of a single dramatic discovery, but as a slow-building avalanche that began in the early 2010s and by the middle of the decade had dismantled the tidy story almost completely. The pivot point came in 2015 when a team led by geneticist Wolfgang Haak at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published a landmark study in Nature analyzing ancient genomic data from 69 Europeans spanning the last 8,000 years. The scale was unprecedented, a sample no larger than a grain of table salt extracted from the petrous bone, the dense inner ear, bone that preserves ancient DNA better than almost any other tissue, could now be sequenced into tens of millions of genetic data points. The paper's conclusions sent a quiet tremor through the archaeological community that grew, in subsequent years, into something closer to an earthquake. Understanding what they found requires a brief detour into the mechanics of ancient genomics. DNA sequencing is like reconstructing a shredded document found at the bottom of a damp archive. Most of the material is degraded, contaminated with environmental bacteria, fragmented into pieces so small that assembly requires extraordinary computational power. Endogenous DNA, the actual genetic material from the ancient individual, as opposed to contamination, often makes up less than 1% of what's extracted. Researchers use haplogroups, which are essentially family trees of genetic mutations shared among populations, to track lineages across time. Autosomal DNA, the 22 pairs of chromosomes that carry the bulk of our ancestry information, allows admixture analysis, calculating what percentage of a modern person's genome derives from which ancient source population. The numbers, when the samples are large enough, are brutally precise. What the 2015 study confirmed, and what subsequent research by David Reich at Harvard Medical School and Johannes Krauss at Tübingen University expanded into a sweeping continental portrait, was this. Modern Europeans are the product of at least three major ancestral source populations. Western hunter-gatherers, the people who had lived in Europe since the Ice Ages. Early European farmers, Neolithic migrants from Anatolia who arrived beginning around 9,000 years ago and brought agriculture, pottery, and the megaliths. And a third population that changed everything, Yamnaya steppe pastoralists who surged out of the Pontic Caspian grasslands around 5,000 years ago and whose genetic contribution to modern Europeans is, depending on the population, between 25 and 75%. The Yamnaya migration was not gradual. The genomic data suggests it was rapid, overwhelming, and in some regions nearly total. In ancient Britain, for example, the data published by Reich's group in 2018 showed that within a few centuries of the Yamnaya arrival, approximately 90% of the pre-existing gene pool was replaced, not softened, not diluted, replaced. But here's where it gets strange. When geneticists turned their sequencing equipment toward the Basque, the expected Yamnaya signature, present in virtually every other modern European population sitting in German genomes, French genomes, English genomes, Spanish genomes, was dramatically, anomalously reduced, not absent, but a fraction of what it should be given the Basque population's geographic position in the heart of Western Europe. A 2019 study by Inigo Alalde at Harvard Medical School analyzing 271 ancient Iberian genomes spanning 8,000 years clarified the picture with forensic precision. The Basque country, it turned out, had received the steppe ancestry wave, but the Yamnaya signal is there, but at significantly lower proportions than surrounding populations. Approximately 20 to 30% of Basque ancestry traces to steppe pastoralists, compared to 40 to 60% in most northern and central Europeans. The remainder of their ancestry consists predominantly of two things: Western hunter-gatherer lineage, the genetic echo of the people who painted the caves of Altamira and Lascaux and hunted reindeer along glacial river valleys during the last ice age, and early European farmer ancestry from the Neolithic Anatolian migrants. These two components, the ancient hunter and the early farmer, are present in all Europeans, but nowhere else on the continent do they persist in such high, undiluted proportions. No mass replacement, No steppe tsunami. A glancing blow and then continuity. The haplogroup data reinforces this portrait with uncomfortable specificity. Haplogroup R1b, the most common Y chromosome lineage in Western Europe today, almost certainly introduced or dramatically amplified by the Yamnaya expansion, is found in approximately 87% of Basque men. That sounds like steppe ancestry dominating, but the specific subclades of R1b present in the Basque are ancient, deep-rooting branches that predate the main Yamnaya expansion. The distribution tells a story of early arrival and then isolation, not of the same mass migration that reshaped Britain or Germany. Meanwhile, mitochondrial haplogroups H and U5b, maternal lineages that trace directly to Western hunter-gatherers and early European farmers, persist in the Basque at frequencies that make population geneticists pause. You are looking at maternal lineages that stretch, in some cases more than 10,000 years, into the past, unbroken, carried by women who lived before the pyramids, before writing, before the wheel. This is what geneticists with characteristic restraint call a ghost signal, not a ghost population in the literal sense. The Basque are very much alive and they are not amused by that framing, but a genetic echo of ancestral populations whose primary contribution to the rest of Europe was almost entirely swamped by subsequent migrations. Comparing 271 ancient Iberian genomes to 2,900 Maotoin modern individuals from across Europe and the Middle East, Olalde's study found that the closest living genetic relatives of Western European hunter-gatherers are the Basque, and that this relationship is not subtle background noise. It is a substantial, defining feature of their genomic architecture. Not from nowhere, from the oldest inhabited layer of Western Europe, not an isolated coincidence, a systematic pattern that holds across autosomal, Y chromosome, and mitochondrial analysis simultaneously, not a trace. A founding contribution that survived, against all probabilistic expectation, into the present. And then there is the language, Euskara. Because the genetics don't just answer questions about the Basque, they reopen a question that linguists had considered essentially closed. For decades, the dominant theory held that Euskara was a pre-Indo-European survivor. Yes, but that its relationship to the Basque people's genetic heritage was largely incidental. Languages and genes don't always travel together. You can adopt a new language in a generation. You can't adopt new DNA. The genomic data now suggests something more charged, that the Basques' relative genetic isolation and their linguistic isolation may not be coincidental at all, that the same cultural or geographic barriers that limited the steppe ancestry influx may also have shielded Euskara from the Indo-European replacement that swept virtually every other pre-existing language off the map of Europe. The connection is not proven. The data suggests, though doesn't confirm, a tangled relationship between biological resistance and linguistic survival that is unlike anything else visible in the European genomic record. We carry pieces of these ancient people in our cells, all of us, in the frayed and diluted way that most Europeans carry a fragment of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, a whisper from the people who first colonized the continent after the glaciers retreated. But in the Basque, that signal is louder, less diluted. The genetic thread running between a modern Basque shepherd in the foothills of the Pyrenees and the hunter-gatherer who sheltered in those same mountains during the Younger Dryas cold snap 12,000 years ago is thinner than we can fully comprehend. But it is there, traceable, measurable, woven into 23 pairs of chromosomes rather than carved in stone or written in clay. This isn't just about one unusual population on the Atlantic fringe of Europe. This is about the outer limit of human genetic continuity, about how much of the past can survive inside a living person. The same pattern of deep ancestry surviving in geographic refugia appears elsewhere in the persistence of Sardinian genomic signatures that trace to early European farmers, in isolated Caucasian populations that carry fragments of Bronze Age steppe lineages at unexpected frequencies, in Amazonian groups whose ancestry connects, against all apparent logic, to populations from southern Asia. Genetic islands in a sea of mixture. The Basque are the most studied, the most genomically characterized of these pockets. But they are not unique in kind, only in the richness of the data we have been able to extract. And that data continues to arrive. Ancient DNA analysis has accelerated dramatically in the past decade, with sequencing costs falling by orders of magnitude and extraction techniques now capable of recovering readable genetic material from samples previously thought useless. The work of Reich, Haak, Krause, Olalde, and their collaborators has already rewritten the textbook version of European prehistory 2 or 3 times over. Future excavations from the Basque country itself, more ancient remains, more detailed temporal sampling, finer resolution on the timing and magnitude of the steppe ancestry arrival, will sharpen the picture further. There are unanswered questions that may have answers buried 10 feet underground in a Neolithic burial site in Navarre or Gipuzkoa, waiting for a trowel and a sequencing machine. And somewhere in the mountains that divide France from Spain, in villages where children walk to school past farmhouses with surnames that appear in no other language, speaking words with no cousins on any continent, the oldest genetic story in Europe is still being lived. The caves at Altamira are 12 kilometers from the Basque border. The people who painted them, the genome data now suggests, are not entirely gone. Their descendants, changed, mixed, weathered by millennia, but carrying that ancient molecular thread, are still there. You can erase a name from stone, you cannot erase it from cells. The story of the Basque genome is not finished. It is only beginning. As ancient DNA technology advances and sampling density increases, we will achieve resolution that makes today's analysis look like a rough sketch. We'll identify the precise timing of the steppe ancestry boundary, the line where the migration lost momentum, where geography or culture or simple chance built an invisible wall. We'll trace the maternal lineages back another 1,000 years and another 1,000 beyond that. And we'll come closer perhaps to understanding not just who the Basque are genetically, but why this particular patch of mountains produced the one population in modern Europe that still carries, in measurable quantities, the genome of the people who were here first. There are hundreds of stories like this one, sitting in petrous bones in museum drawers and laboratory freezers, waiting for extraction and sequencing and the slow, difficult work of interpretation. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the rewriting of human prehistory is not a project from the past. It is happening right now in laboratories from Leipzig to Cambridge to Boston, one ancient genome at a time,